Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 10 of the Future of Work show. So, if you've been with us on this journey, then you will know that every week, mostly on Saturdays, me and a guest, we sit and chat about some aspect of the future that will be helpful for all of us to understand. I have the advantage that I get to pick guests and topics that are really of interest to me. So I must confess that I do make full use of that advantage to get some of the finest, smartest, and most genuine people to this show. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, hi, my name is Shalini, and I work at the intersection of people and organizations and the future of work, along with my colleague Jaspreet Pindra, who works on business and technology and how it intersects with the future of work. Both of us are both educators and advisors. Now for today's show. Today is Teachers' Day. And therefore, we have with us someone who is a very respected professor who also works in an area that is very, very close to the kind of work that we do. What will be the future of leadership is the topic of our conversation, and I'm just going to bring him on. Hi,
Hi,
Ram.
hi, Shalini. Good to see you.
Good to see you, and so nice to have you here. So, for those of you who are new to Ram, Professor Ram Nidumolu of the Indian School of Business, Hyderabad, is he studied in India, a graduate of the Indian Institute of Science, then went to IIM Calcutta, did his PhD at the Anderson Graduate School of Management at UCLA, my own alma mater, and worked for several colleges in the US before coming to India and working with the Indian School of Business. His own interests, academic interests and otherwise, are very eclectic. So he works at the intersection of business strategy, innovation, leadership, and as he told me just a few minutes ago, the philosophy of science. So we're sure to have a really, really interesting conversation today. Thank you, Ram. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Shalini. Thank you. Thank you.
So, one of the things we want to do differently, and Ram wants to do this as much as I do today, is that we want to keep this interactive. So, I'm going to ask Ram questions that I would like you to also consider and share your observations and your comments on the comment box. And somewhere in the course of our discussion, we'll get to some of those comments, and I'm sure that will make the conversation much more multidimensional. So, my intent today is that while Ram and I will lead the dialogue, this dialogue actually is going to involve many, many more of us and many of those who are joining. So, having said that, Ram, I know that you work in the area of leadership, and I want to ask you, what do you see happening around us that suggests that the future of leadership is likely to be different?
Very
And my
interesting.
question, sorry, and sorry, I'm still
Yeah,
new at
no,
this.
good.
My question to all those who are watching us, I want you also to reflect on that and share your thoughts around, do you expect the future of leadership to look different? And if yes, why and in what ways? With that,
Yeah,
back to you, Ram.
very interesting. Very interesting. And since today is Teachers' Day, I think it's good to, in order to answer that question, it's also good to think in terms of the kinds of teachers we admired when we were growing up, and the kinds of teachers the kids admire now. How has that changed? I think in that sense. And so when I think of the big role models in my life, my grandfather, my English school teacher, professors that I was taught at, they were wonderful teachers. But I would say at some level, and perhaps these are the sages of ancient India also, they
Mm,
were the sages, they were the, what do you call them, the sages on the stage, right? The one who essentially was the source of information, source of instruction, source
mm.
of guidance, and the pupils were recipients. And I think that model has changed now, right? So we often call it, as you know, the guide by the side instead of the sage on the stage. And I think that's what's happening to leadership also. So what used to work for the last 100 years, with the Industrial Revolution coming to fruition through the industrial enterprise, where it was mainly a bureaucracy, centralized, and a CEO or a senior leader who knew what needed to be done. and really was more directive in nature. And that was probably characteristic, despite the information revolution and so on, was characteristic of much of the last century. And I think
Mhm.
that's changed. And it's hard to see these changes until you're well into it. And I think that's
Mhm.
what's happening now with the COVID crisis, with technology, the way it's disrupting. I think our models of leadership, that kind of central command and control, directive kind of leader, that I think is less and less suitable now. We can, inquire as to why, but I think those models are going away. They're still there, still very prominent in India, but I feel in the future we'll see a lot more of that guide by the side, the coach as leader, the one who empowers, the one who sets the conditions for making decisions as opposed to taking decisions. And I think that
Mhm.
reflects changes in the environment, changes in society, and so on.
Do you think there'll be some aspects of leadership, though, that will sort of be constant across, or do you think
Yeah.
it will fundamentally shift?
Yes, yes, no, absolutely, absolutely, and I think that that's why I'm very interested in the philosophy of leadership and so on. So, for example, values, the importance of integrity, the importance of values, the importance of the love for learning, those are eternals, and they've always been there. They were there in the Upanishads. They were there in ancient Greece, for example. They were there all through the Middle Ages. They were there in the Industrial Revolution. Those things will remain. Those core virtues, as they were called, love for
Hmm.
learning, love for inquiry, love for certainly value-centered approach to this.
Yeah.
Those will remain, and I think as technology increasingly automates not just what we do, but how we think, AI in particular, I think that will be the last frontier when it comes to values and meaning and so on. Those intrinsic virtues, I think, would be the last one to be automated or made artificial intelligent. So yes, those will remain very important, I think.
That's so
Uh,
interesting you should say that, Ram, because I've always felt that there is this inner core, of leadership, which is timeless. And it
yeah,
has things like courage, character, compassion,
yeah,
vision, which, no matter which era of human society or which organization we look at, people
yeah,
who have some of those, now very few people have all of those, but people who have
yeah.
some of those, are the inspiring leaders, and they're
Right.
the ones whom people want to follow.
And who in your
uh,
past challenge was like that? Can you think of someone in your past?
Sorry, who am
Who in
I?
your past was that kind of a leader for you?
Oh, yeah.
You
In
know,
fact, some of the business leaders who brought about a lot of changes in India, both at the time when Indian
right?
industry was just setting up, but also I would say in three different stages. One, when it was setting up, again when Indian organizations were transforming. Then the
Yeah,
ones which managed that transformation successfully almost
right,
always had at least one or two people
yeah,
right at the top who had some of these qualities,
right,
character, credibility,
right.
compassion, vision, some of these, because without that, it's really hard to
Yeah,
lead an army of people in the same
yeah,
direction, no matter how smart your strategy might
yeah.
be.
And
Now
the
we're finding
idea,
it. Sorry,
yeah.
go ahead.
I'm sorry for interrupting you. I think you're absolutely right. Someone like a Jane
Yeah,
Tata, Jari Tata. The
yeah,
idea is,
yeah,
so if we look at the older books on leadership, business leadership,
yeah,
let's say we focus, because leadership is an age-old topic.
yeah,
Leadership was studied by the ancient Greeks, they were studied by the ancient Indians, and so on. But let's say we focus on leadership since the 19th century, the late 19th century. So if you look at leaders, business leaders in the 1900s, 1910, 1930, the
yeah,
ones who were really admired and then in India and elsewhere were those kind of leaders with a sense of
yeah.
social responsibility, the ones who took care of their employees, the ones who didn't think of profit making as the only pursuit, who had a larger purpose for their company. And I think so. There's been a cycle in the 70s, 80s, and so on. Those were sort of abandoned, I would say. And so, when and in particular, I think certain models came in into leadership that looked at much more just the outcomes, the extrinsic outcomes. But I see a return to those values now. I've done a lot of work in
I
sustainability.
think every time there's a change or a major shift, what we see is something quite interesting. So we see on the one hand this inner core, which this timeless inner
Yeah,
core, and on the other hand, something that is really in tune with the time it is in. So this inner core, in my
yeah,
own words, would be this culture, compassion, character, vision piece,
yeah,
uh, which is the inspirational part. But then
yeah,
on top of that is what enables you to be successful in this particular day and age.
Context.
And
Yeah.
that, for instance, in today's environment is completely different. So,
Yeah.
with change outside being so much faster than anything that any of us have ever experienced in the past, and likely to be much, much faster,
Right.
qualities like your ability to make sense of these changes, understand these changes, generate
Yeah.
a response internally for these changes, build the capacity of the organization to be innovative, responsive, liquid, if you like,
Yeah.
and be able to quickly, either through experimentation or through other, means, to be
Yeah.
able to make very quick moves. And in
Yeah.
a sense, I sometimes feel that that itself means at the back end, if you want to create an organization which can do all of that, you need to be far more collaborative
Yeah.
and far
Right.
more decentralized than ever in the past.
Yeah.
The high
It's
power
interesting
distance
you
is
mentioned that.
gone.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that because in some ways, I think if you look at the leadership literature, the way in
Yeah.
which leadership itself has evolved, right? There was initially a lot of emphasis on activities, doing the right thing at the right time, and so on,
Yeah.
being very efficient and so on. There was a lot of that kind of situational leadership, and there's also this whole sense of charismatic. But I
Yes.
think now certainly authentic leadership, but I feel authentic leadership reflects something deeper. And I think what you're saying is there are these different layers. There's a layer which is all about your core self, right? So, core
Yeah.
self. Then there is a layer about outside of that, which is about the particular context. And then there is certainly the other part, which is more forward looking, long term looking,
Yeah.
and so on. So I think the interesting question here is how. So one question that a lot of senior leaders ask is, how do I get in touch with that core self, that core part?
Mm.
That's one. Because we've all been so caught up in doing, we've been so caught up in deadlines and outcomes and so on. So how can one reconnect with that core part? I think is an interesting one. And the second one is how can one not just because leadership is not just about me, but about the people around me. How can
Mm.
I enable others around me also to reconnect, to find meaning, real meaning in work, find the kind of expression, self expression in work, and so on? I think these are some hard questions. Any thoughts
And
on
now,
that?
oh, well, you asked me. I was just going to ask you because I know you do a lot of work in that. I think one thing that's been really underemphasized, both in business school curriculum and in, to be honest, leadership programs. And, you and I both have spent forever in business school
Yeah.
doing our MBAs and PhDs. And
Yes.
of course, both of us have been part of many kinds of leadership development programs. So, one of the things that across the board never gets emphasized is the amount of inner work that you need to do
Yes.
to really
Absolutely.
come to some of these answers. It doesn't
Absolutely.
just drop on your desk one day. Courage or character or
Absolutely.
credibility, or it takes it's an outward expression of stuff that's happening on the inside. And
Yes.
somehow, for reasons I really don't know, maybe just because it's a very difficult topic to really, do
Yeah.
justice to,
Yeah.
it gets left out, sometimes
Right.
relegated to electives in business school,
Right.
sometimes,
Absolutely.
but it's
Absolutely.
never part of core OB, which you teach and
Yeah.
I've also
Yeah.
taught. So it's just never talked about.
It's
Neither
very
is it
interesting.
spoken about
Yeah.
in corporate training programs,
Right.
where a lot of it is about, how do you tweak your leadership style so that people around you can be more effective, which is
Yeah.
certainly important. But that's very much at the surface. It's not
So
at
it's very
all what.
interesting you mention it. So I think there's a way to. I've felt the same thing. So at ISB, and what I realized is I learned a lot of this, and not through by teaching of leadership or by studying leadership, but actually by the practice of. So I left academia in 1999 and was an entrepreneur and ran companies for about 20 years. That's when I really learned it. And I
Mm.
think that's what is the irony. You learn it through experience. And what I've learned is I call it being full leadership. Leadership that enables you to be in touch with and express your core being. And I feel there are some key capabilities we should try and develop and we should enable our team to develop. And one is self awareness. I think the beginning of this kind of being full leadership or self leadership is self awareness, knowing our values, knowing what we stand for, knowing what we're strong at, not what, knowing what we're not good at, knowing what triggers our anger, our emotions, and so on. So I think self awareness is a foundation. Then I think empathy. I think empathy is important. Humility, empathy and humility go together.
Mhm.
This realization that I may be the CEO, I may be a C level, but I need to listen to others. I need to understand others. I need to see it from their viewpoint. Satya Nadella, I think, exemplifies that, especially customers. I think self control is another very important one. We often underemphasize self discipline. So it's hard to be in that position, hard to make all these difficult decisions. And finally, integrity. I think that's when doing what we say we will do, not just doing the right thing. So there's some core capabilities or virtues which we should consciously develop. And I think you're right that they don't get emphasized. Leadership is seen as leading others as opposed to leading oneself, beginning with one's own leadership. And I think that's an eternal truth. I think it will be
Yeah,
there 100 years from now. It was there 2,500 years ago. It's mentioned in the Upanishads repeatedly. It's mentioned in the Greek classics repeatedly. It'll never go away. I think. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I'm just going to read some of the comments from many, many people who are writing it. Uh, So Gotham speaks about future of leadership will definitely be different. We will completely move away from command and control to more distributed decision making. Speed of execution, agility of an organization will be key. Therefore, non-hierarchical organizations will evolve and decision making will be distributed. Gotham, we completely agree with you. In fact, to be honest, when we just look at the research and say, okay, what is it that enables an organization to be adaptive, innovative, and agile? Exactly what you're saying comes up as being proven time and time again as being a predictor of some of what businesses will need to survive. Niharika says leadership should not be profit based, it should be based on societal value welfare. I think that's the kind of theme that you spoke to, Ram, that, in
Yeah.
a certain
The
era, that
higher
was the kind
purpose.
of leadership
Yeah.
that was. Srinivas speaks about decision making in a boardroom is the biggest mistake by leaders. Interesting.
Yeah.
Gotham says a leader can touch the core part in itself when he starts looking at people or organizations not as resources but as possibilities. Very nice. When you look at people as possibilities, by the way, that's a really good slogan, people as
Good
possibilities.
stuff. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
discover new dimensions for self and for people. GK says our management education lacks in the core cont of leadership traits. Most of the leadership traits are not trainable but mental. GK, you're absolutely right. In fact, I don't know if you read Warren Bennis much, but one of the things he says in every leadership book is that no leaderships have ever been created by a leadership training program, which is not good news for people
Yeah.
like me. But it is something he speaks to. That is true. These are qualities, or there's an inner work which everyone has to
Yeah.
do by themselves. But maybe what helps is reminding them that that inner work exists.
Yeah,
And
but if I can
Manju,
comment on that, that's an interesting point. If I can now, so
yeah,
I,
yeah,
I
please.
think a very key point made. I think this is also called. This used to be called about 10 years ago the crucibles of leadership. You know that
Yeah,
expression.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
That leadership is really forged in adversity, and
yeah,
leadership is forged much more in difficult experiences than in things that went well. Because you don't learn so much from what went well; you learn a lot from what went wrong. Right? I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think to the point where not to invite adverse experiences, but see them as opportunities, and especially now, what's going on? These are opportunities for leadership. The kind of turmoil we're seeing is really where it's a crucible for leadership. And I think that's an important one to be aware of. Of course, the question is how. And also, I think, Shalini, we should be careful not to be too rosy-eyed about all these traits, right? Many situations will still call for very difficult, tough, centralized leadership, especially when time is of urgency. So we need to be careful not to see this as that there's a toughness behind this also,
yeah,
right? That's an important point. Otherwise, it will all be seen as kumbaya kind of leadership.
yeah, yeah,
That's something
yeah.
to be careful about. It's not kumbaya leadership we're talking about, right? All sit
In fact,
around and sing.
let me ask you that because to run a very decentralized organization or a very empowered
Yeah,
organization, um, don't you need great clarity on your basic, you know, organizing principles, decision making criteria, call it culture, values? I mean, you can give many, this could be, the
yeah,
criteria could belong to many different worlds, but the more empowered you need a team to be, is there not a certain sense of
Yeah.
centralized clarity on a few pieces that are
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
not to
No, I
be?
think that's very true. I think it's very true. And one way to get that clarity is look at what poor leadership is. So we get more clarity on what is good leadership by looking at poor leadership. Often, poor leadership is inability to delegate, micromanaging, not trusting people, and these often come from a lack of security, self security, a huge ego, lack of security, and so on, lack of a sense of lack, a personal lack, right? And that's where you have indecisive leadership or arbitrary leadership or emotional leadership. All these come from some weaknesses within the self. And that's why I think people who have that clarity of what they stand for, especially their values, what they're willing to tolerate, not willing to tolerate, those people have a kind of toughness. And even though they're compassionate and understanding and empathic and so on, it's also true that there is a toughness because they know their principles. And when that comes through to others, then they get less pushed around. And so I think that's what it is. It's a simultaneous toughness along with that compassion. So it's a paradox. And I think in the end, leadership is about paradoxes, I think,
Yeah.
mastering
It's
these paradoxes.
it's about managing two opposites. Very well
Yeah,
said. Because I agree. I
yeah,
think to be empowering means complete
yeah,
clarity on something, you know.
yeah,
Otherwise,
yeah.
it's just application. But I'm going
Right.
to now take you to a different track, Ram. We've
Yeah,
spoken a lot about, the eternal stuff. Maybe we've just started touching what changes. And,
yeah,
I want to ask you a little more about what do the external changes mean for senior leaders today,
yeah,
particularly changes in technology. Uh, how should someone even begin to make sense of the many many emerging technologies, the impact they're going to have on business, and the way organizations have to be structured? Uh, any thoughts around what
right.
this
Yeah,
huge shift means for
yeah,
existing senior leaders?
yeah. So it's a very good question. So let me orient that question towards what kind of a workplace should one try to create, right? What kind of an atmosphere? So I actually feel in a setting like this, senior leaders really need to tap into that higher purpose, the one that the caller was talking about, right? So that's important. People have their own concerns, their own capabilities, and so on. So you have to find a way to align their purpose. No longer will they just listen to what you say, as they used to do some years ago. But you have to first find a way to align their purpose with this higher purpose and with your own purpose as a leader, what you're learning. Second, you also have to find a way to get people to be engaged and find their work to be meaningful. That's very important. Meaning is
Mm.
important. People work much better. All the research suggests that when they have a sense of purpose, when they have a sense of meaning, they tend to be more creative, more productive, and so on. So those are the outcomes you want. And certainly the well-being also matters. So given these, then the question is, how do you look at technologies then, right? Which is the original question. So you should then see, yes, there will be a lot of automation. That's inescapable. Many things are going to be automated. What we now think can never be automated is actually fast disappearing. If you look
Yeah.
at the changes in AI, it's astounding what AI is capable of. And I invite people to go to deepmind.com, where some of the latest AI is shown. And almost anything and everything that's at the cognitive level is getting automated, will get automated because of these deep learning algorithms that they have, these reinforcement algorithms, and so on. So I feel on the cognitive side, things that we thought we were good at will fast disappear in the next 20, 30 years. So that leaves the meaning side, the meaning and the values and the inspiration side. And that's where I feel is the real opportunity. That leaders need to create an inspiring workplace, need to create structures that enable employees, and often they're decentralized structures, enable employees to tap into their inspiration, tap into their passion, and so on. And so teams that are more self empowered, but at the same time, that control is important. It can never be that kind of anarchy in a sense. So, yes, new self empowered organizations with some level of control. And that control could often, your old advisor, Bill Ochi, control doesn't have to be structures, but through norms, workplace norms, and those. So, control is not just in terms of procedures and so on, those informal norms, those common shared elements of culture. I think those are the ones that human beings will now need to design because AI is not yet there. AI has not reached the level of consciousness that requires these kinds of capabilities, where you're aware of your feelings, you're aware of the feelings of others, and so on. I think that'll happen next century, but we have about 40, 50 years to work on that. Yeah,
So, Ram, let me ask you. I get this about the internal organization, actually. And we had this really interesting conversation a few weeks ago on the idea of a liquid organization,
yeah,
you know, because research by another professor at Miami Business School was all about, his research on how liquid an organization
yeah,
was
yeah,
correlated with their capacity to respond to the COVID crisis we are in.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
it was very interesting. Uh,
yeah,
but my question is actually a little broader.
yeah,
Uh, you see, for a leader from here on, would it not be critical to be able to understand the business impact, not the internal impact, but the impact that a series of emerging technologies and a
yes,
series
yeah,
of therefore new business models can have on their business? How does
yes.
one even begin to develop that capacity?
Well, you're absolutely right. In the end, it is about business impact, right? I think the one way to is to be curious and learn about it. Make the effort to learn. It's hard for an earlier generation, people in their 50s and 60s. It's hard in some ways to, at this stage, I'm in my 60s, and it's hard to learn these new technologies. But I think we need to make that effort. Get outside our comfort zone, spend time learning some of the technology. Don't be masters at it. Enough about these algorithms, enough about the impacts, the case studies of
Hmm.
how these kinds of technologies have impacted business, which areas, which functions, which industries, what kind of impact have they had, and is it possible? It's not just automation; it's also collaboration. How can humans collaborate with AI or these technologies? How can humans augment themselves? How can they augment? So it's that collaborative approach. So yes, spend the time learning about it, spend the time doing pilots in it, experimenting it, create a culture where you enable that kind of experimentation. And I would say one other thing about leadership, and this is often overlooked, we don't always have to be a leader. It's not always, I think that too will change. Leaders need to also be comfortable being followers. So in a setting like this, a new technology, maybe the leader is this young guy who's just come out of college or maybe 5 years, knows all about this, and you be that person's apprentice in a way. Find ways to be learning from someone else. I think that's also true. We'll need to shift in our approach to you don't always have to be a leader. So it's that kind of the desire to learn, the learning
Isn't
mindset
it
of
isn't it a big shift though, Ram? Because many people who are leaders today were not digital natives. They have, been successful for, a certain set of capabilities that were
yeah,
different because,
yeah,
that's what was needed in the past. But to
yeah,
suddenly think technology first, or at
yeah,
least right at the start, and therefore,
yeah,
what are the business implications of
yeah,
technology, and of course, what are the internal implications of
yeah,
technology?
yeah,
Isn't that hard? And if you have seen leaders make a good transition through that,
yeah.
do you have any sense of what goes into that transition?
Yeah, so I think it's hard from a more mindset viewpoint, not so much in the technical skills viewpoint, because you're not asked to become a technical expert, but it's your own sense of how complete your knowledge is and your willingness to learn from someone clearly much junior to you in the organization, someone who's not in. So it's that kind of adjustment of our ego at some level, right? And I actually feel a good example of this. I recommend the Microsoft case study. Satya Nadella is one. I actually
Mm,
feel that's a great example. It's an excellent case study on how to make this kind of shift in mindsets, where you go from what he calls a know-it-all mindset, which is the problem. The higher you go, the more you adopt this know-it-all mindset to a learn-it-all mindset. And
mm,
it also
mm,
goes into your day-to-day interactions with people. Let's say someone comes up to you with a good idea, right? And you have a lot of experience in that domain. Your tendency is to shoot down that idea, to sort of confirm. It's called a confirmatory response, but changing the way you respond to ideas and building on it and enabling you to learning from that idea as opposed to shooting holes in it. So it's those small changes in mindset, I think, is the hardest part. And that requires going back to the self, going back to being more humble in some ways, that you too are a novice in many things. The world is changing. You can learn. This is almost the first generation in history where our generation can learn more from the next generation than at any time before, right? Typically in the past, the trade and so on, the parents would pass on the trade to their children, but now this is a singularity in that sense, a reversal. So I think yes, be more humble in that. I would say
Ram,
that's the
I find it very interesting that, as your own areas of interest, on the one hand, there's a lot about, innovation, strategy, business, all about what needs to happen in the outside world, within the organization, how the organization should act in the outside world, right? And at the same time, you have a deep interest in Indian philosophy in particular and the
yeah.
lessons for leadership. Your book is also, focused on that. So, would you like to share how these two coexist in your own head?
Yes, the contradictions we're talking about. They coexist very well, actually. So, what it does is, if you have a deep interest in philosophy, then you're not afraid of change. You realize that far bigger changes have happened before. The Axial Age, for example, between 800 BC and 300 BC, was a tumultuous period. Civilizations fell. There was tremendous, climate crisis also at that time, massive migrations, and that change in society, terrible conditions, far more brutal than they are now, led to this flowering of thought in terms of the Upanishads, Greek philosophy, Mesopotamia, Chinese, and so on. It led to, and that's why it's called the Axial Age, the greatest intellectual thinking that the world has seen. So I think we are in a similar neo-Axial Age now. So I think philosophy, interest in ancient matters, tells you that we've been there before. We will manage this. We will nothing to be afraid of. So I see the same with AI. I don't see artificial intelligence as anything to be scared about. So it reduces your fear of these things, and that's how
A
they
lot,
coexist.
a lot of senior leaders actually have an interest in Indian philosophy, I find, at least in India. Uh, it's also generational, perhaps, but many, many have an interest in Indian philosophy. So, do you think that a reading of Indian philosophy can somewhere help leaders live through this change well?
Oh, absolutely. I almost would say that is probably the best source of this. That beyond the management books we read and the change management literature that you and I read and contribute to, I think the philosophy that we find, not just ancient India, but ancient times, I think is a great source because it stood the test of time. What is the best evidence of a powerful idea? It stands 3,000 years of inquiry, right? The notion of being is 3,000
Right,
years old. Anything that you and I create now will be there for 10 years and then disappear, right? But
right.
something that Darwinian, I guess, the resolution of the Darwinian selection process shows that these ideas are eternal in that sense. So, yes, I think there's a lot to be, and at least the first thing to be learned is equanimity, peace of mind, the sense of calmness, not to fear, not to be anxious about this. That's, I think, the first thing to learn. And then comes all the others, the development of a higher purpose, the development of a vision, all those come. But the first, it's a direct benefit to you. It's benefited me. When I did my startup in Silicon Valley, it was just terrible. But this gave me a lot of calm and confidence and peace of mind. Yes.
Right, right. I'm just going to read through some of the comments. Um, Manjunathan says, show do do leaders show ego to have control on people? I guess that's a comment. Is
Okay.
spirituality compatible with leadership? I think that's what you're speaking to. Why leaders still don't encourage open feedback to improve working culture and business performance? Do you want
Insecurity and fear. Well, let me just take that up, right? It's not just one of the things you learn is not to just blame the leader, right? It's easy to find the leader as the target for the blame. It's very common. It's a way for us to escape our own responsibility. But often these are systemic. If you have a CEO who encourages this and the culture is not set up that way, then negative feedback and others begin to say this is a terrible CEO. The board replaces. So there are all those other things. So one has to have that. That's what I mean by that kind of awareness.
In
That
fact,
we
I'm
are
very
all vulnerable.
very
Go ahead.
glad that you brought that up because it's not that this is a journey which happens when you're a leader. It happens in your life. It is part of your life journey. The extent
Yeah,
to which you do the inner work, it'll express itself on the outside at all levels of organization. It's not that
yeah,
you have to, cross a certain threshold and only then it becomes important. That's not at all the
right,
case, in fact.
right. You're
But
correct.
are
Yeah,
there any specific challenges that you've seen for people who are particularly fairly senior, given the fact that, particularly in high power distance countries like ours, uh,
yeah,
people would hesitate, or high power distance organizations anywhere in the world, why just here?
yeah,
Would people
yeah.
be extra like careful not to offend, and therefore, how does that
Yeah,
play out?
it's not so much offend, but it's being seen as weak, I think. That's one. Because, empowerment also requires people who are willing to be empowered. That is also there, right? It takes two to tango in that sense. And if the culture is one of tell me what to do, and the model of leadership that everyone has is the great leader who tells you what to do, then if you come with a different mindset and different model, it's tough on the followers, it's tough on the culture, it's tough on customers, on the board, and so on. So you fight many battles, and many leaders, even if they're willing, then find it difficult to address these issues
Yeah,
that go beyond them, beyond their willingness. So
yeah,
you
yeah,
have to then, yes, you have to thread this needle with over time, not right away, not sort of open the kimono right away, but over time. So you have to coach people in that sense. When we think of leadership, perhaps the number one trait in leadership, capable in leadership, is coaching your people. Google's done all that research you're aware of that.
yeah.
So among its program project leaders, and so the number one leadership capability is coaching others. So it requires a lot of coaching in terms of how to respond to empowering leadership and so on. So yeah, so that's the first step. Do it slowly. Do a lot of coaching. Certainly communicate, and be very persistent, and be willing to, you're standing for something that goes beyond this particular company. So it has to become your life principle, and that's where courage comes in. Is this something you're willing to give your career for? And that's a hard question. Yeah,
It's a really tough question because I think, Ram, when people decide whether they should act this way or that way in an organizational setting, uh,
yeah,
I mean, I don't know anyone who's, or say, I would say very, very few people who wouldn't be constantly making that evaluation of, will this be helpful for me, my standing in the organization? Would this not be helpful for me? So, courage, there are workplaces where it's easier than
yeah,
other places. And
yeah,
I wonder if you have any thoughts around, how does one build good leaders in organizations where there are few good leaders to start off with?
yeah, yeah. So what I feel is, so clearly leadership programs, as you and I know, they're nice, but not an end in itself, right? They just spark that right thinking.
They're a
So
spark.
they just spark. But it's an important spark. It's just a seed, right? So you have to. So it depends on. So you have to see yourself as not a victim. That's number one. You have to see yourself, even if you're not the CEO, even if you're not the VP. Let's say you're a team leader, then right off you should tell yourself, sure, the rest of the organization is very different leadership style, but I'm going to just try in my own team setting, in that limited thing that I can control. Let me try this different
Mm,
approach to leadership, and a more empowering approach, a more collaborative approach, a more authentic approach, and so on. So that's step number one: not to be a victim, but to own your problem and not to blame my CEO and the others and so on. That's point number one. Point number two is do small steps. Small steps. Try things out. It can't change, can't happen right away. So I have a process which I call the REAL process, REAL, and this is described in the book, and so it's worked quite well. First, recognize this need for change and recognize your purpose from this. That's very important. It has to align with what you want to make of your life, and that's the
mm,
recognition stage. In the recognition stage, the most important is just making the conceptual case for it, and you can do so in your small team. The second stage is give experiences of it. What will it look like if you did this? And typically, these experiences are much more satisfying to employees, much more
mm,
empowering. It releases them, in the way you conduct meetings, listening to them, and so on, as opposed to telling them. So that's very important because then that gets to your whole being, not just your mind, but your being. Then you begin to create those habits, which are called anchoring. Let them, daily you begin to do these. So it becomes more institutionalized. And then in the last stage, you sort of spread it to the rest of the organization. That's the leadership. So it's all small steps, thinking of the changes in the mindset, building that seed of recognition, giving them experiences. That's very important. Otherwise, they don't get it. On all what we're saying, many people will not get it. They may say, this is not going to work in my place, and so on. To show it does work. And often it does work. Pleasantly, it does work. So yeah, so you need this kind of a thought through process, which you're very persistent at and not to abandon. So yeah, so
Very
we
nice.
actually do something like this in LV Prasada Institute, and it's been successful. Of course,
Right.
still a lot of challenges. Yeah,
Right.
but follow
No,
up.
it would make sense because, I'm glad you spoke about take smaller steps, build courage, because courage, as we know, builds step by step.
Yeah,
Even the people we really admire, say a Gandhi or a Martin
right,
Luther King, it's not like they suddenly one day emerged fully formed.
right,
They went
exactly.
through years and years where they were consistently bigger acts of courage. But you
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
it
yeah.
courage is one of those things which can snowball if you let it. Uh,
Yes,
but it
this is again ancient wisdom. Same thing. This whole stage, you may listen to the fact that our self is not what it's meant to be, that we are a larger self. But even in Vedanta, for example, there's a long stage, nididhyasana, right, where it takes a lot of practice, a lot of internalizing, and that's the word sadhana.
mm,
Tremendous internalizing and practicing, which can stretch decades, according to Vedanta, multiple lifetimes. Yeah, that persistence is needed, and courage gets built. And this example of Gandhi being thrown off the train, while it's amplified, it's seen as the moment, but really it was just one of many moments in his
yeah,
life.
I'm
Yeah,
sure.
it was
Yeah,
one
yeah.
spark. There were many other sparks that built up the Gandhi that he was when he came back to India in 1919, right?
And I think
1916.
And I think
Yeah,
that's a really important part for us to remember as thinking of ourselves as leaders or anyone else, that it's a journey. And it's
yeah,
not that, suddenly someone's a leader or not a leader. It is a journey. And it is a journey where and you have to have some motivation for it, but, whatever's your motivation for inner work that will, eventually express,
yeah.
it gets consistently stronger and you develop that, but it doesn't happen overnight. In fact, it
Right.
does in most of these cases take a long, long time.
Yeah.
Though of course there are exceptions. There are young people who are leaders. People like Greta Thunberg are showing us
Right.
how a teenager can
Comes,
take the lead. Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. So that's another
Yeah,
counterpoint. Let me just take a
yeah.
look at some of the other questions. Uh, can academicians, Vijay Kumar is asking, with a lot of knowledge, be effective leaders in a real situation?
Very interesting question. So, again, academics can spark, right? And many of us, Shalini and I, just to correct any confusion there, we also have a lot of work experience. Shalini, you worked a lot. I worked for many companies. So, we are not true academics in that sense. But even if one were to consider a pure academic, right? I think they perform a very valuable role because they can give you insights, and often these insights, the spark is very important. You can go through your life and never have that spark. But what you do with that spark, the candle that bursts into flames and so on, it comes from experience. But yes, the spark is critical though. So I would
Right.
say yes, it takes everyone. It takes a village to create a leader.
Yeah, it was a tough, nice, interesting question.
Yeah,
Uh, Dinesh says, small question, why many times a leader encourages the status quo out of fear? If
yeah,
the leader decides to defy progressiveness and enjoy the status quo, even if it means what did he bring, which is his own.
yeah. Interesting question. So my answer to that would be twofold. So externally, the status quo, that famous line about it's hard to convince a person to change when their salary depends on the status quo, right? What was there? So I think that's
Yeah.
one. If the incentive is towards all that you get extrinsically is based on preserving the status quo, then you will do that. But there's an equivalent internal also. And the equivalent internal is reinforcing your self image. If the status quo reinforces your sense and doesn't threaten you, then
Hmm.
you're incentivized to maintain it. It's sort of an internal salary you draw, right? So there's an external salary that you draw by preserving the status quo. There's an internal comfort and self-esteem as the salary that you draw by preserving the status quo. Then you would do it. It's human nature to do it. So you have to, yeah,
On the
change
back
those.
of on the back
Sorry?
of that question, Ram, just on the back of that question, I wonder what are your thoughts around the fact that technology is changing, and in the next 10 years we're likely to see apparently 100 years worth of change. Uh,
Yes. Yeah.
how do you think, as human beings or as leaders, do we have that much adaptive capacity to match the pace of technology? What's your sense?
Yeah, so, and this is where again history and philosophy, I actually feel we do. As a species, we do. Tremendous. I mean, if you see the kinds of, after the Second World War, the devastation after the Second World War, after the 1918 flu pandemic. So we have coped with far, far more difficult as a species. I think the challenge comes in individual groups and pockets. Certain groups don't. And I think that's where the ability to constantly see life as lifelong learning, that change is the Buddha's message, that change is the one constant, and to really recognize that and not to fear it. So, as an individual, we may not work, but as a species, absolutely. And keep in mind, our species is also co evolving. We are not now what we were 100 years ago, and we are certainly not now what we were 1,000 years ago. So, maybe 100 years from now, we would not be having this kind of audio conference. If you see the kind of improvements taking place in brain machine interface, where really the ability to have your thoughts control. We may not at all have this, so we would be a very different species, I think. And as AI gets more, and these are cyborgs and so on, we would change ourselves. So we change by changing ourselves, and I think that's definitely going to happen. We are an extremely inventive species, and that's what's made us the masters and the predators that we are of all species. So yes, my answer is yes.
That's a very interesting perspective. Do you also feel that part of this change will come as humans and technology themselves get merged in interesting
Yes,
ways?
yes, yes. I mean, we have already merged the cell phone we
We've
have,
already-
this communication that to someone, 2,000 years ago, we would be aliens, right? To be able to have a conversation like this, we'd be people, we'd be gods. This is what 2,000 years ago people thought gods would interact like, to not have to come to a particular place to talk to someone. So to them, we would be like gods. And just in 100 years, the kinds of human beings we will become, they will be like gods to us now. The ability to communicate from a distance, not use these kinds of external means. Perhaps even the body itself may not be really needed. And so yes, in 100 years, we would be very different from what we are. And that would be normal for those species,
Yeah,
completely normal. So yeah. So and if
very.
what people say about yes, exactly. So yeah, so we are at the brink of far greater discoveries than we've ever had before. I
So
actually
let me
feel.
then come to the last question I have, Ram.
Yeah.
What would you say are the three or four pillars, if you like, for the future of leadership?
Right. So I would say the three things to do, right? Beyond values and so on, right? Values, and we talked about values. If I were a leader now, and I'm thinking, I'd say among the three things, one, be very curious. Be very curious and wanting to learn. See this as the best time to learn. Set time aside, get people to teach you. I mean, you have the resources to ask for an expert to teach you. Make that part of your life. Every day, get someone to teach you something. You try out something. So, one, learn, be curious. Two, develop your emotional abilities relating to the other person. Develop that. Certainly, we already are strong analytically, many leaders are, but to learn that capability, the whole thing about understanding others. And I don't just mean in terms of empathy and so on, but a kind of care and so on. Because in the end, that's what leadership ultimately, it's about inspiring and mobilizing people, not machines. And so that's the second one. And third, don't fear change. Consciously be comfortable being out of your box. Learn to the contradictions I was talking about. Our brain, our self is very capable of handling out of comfort zones, inside comfort, and so on. Trust evolution. We evolved as a species to be very comfortable with change. Go with that. So curiosity, empathy, and embrace change. I think
Very
you'll do
well.
well. But,
I'm going to build a little bit on that and say,
sure.
this for leaders from here on the capacity to live at least in part in the future and be thinking about possibilities that are opening up both how to design organizations, how to design their business strategies, how to leverage all the changes that are coming up.
Yeah.
Some kind of futures thinking, living in the future,
Absolutely.
while we've all engaged in it sporadically, but
Yeah.
it becomes a much, much stronger key pillar almost for being successful in the
Absolutely.
past. And all of that's
Absolutely.
aided by the kind of inner work that you're speaking about, because otherwise it might be, it might feel a little overwhelming. But if the internal anchor is strong, then
Yeah.
you have the capacity to spend much, much greater time in the future. And of course,
Yeah.
in order to spend more time on thinking about what the future might bring, it means that you need to build an organization where
Yeah.
you are not involved in everything, at least.
Yeah.
So there
Yeah.
will be, some kind of recalibration of
Right.
what are the pieces which are only yours, and definitely the
Yeah.
values, purpose,
Yeah.
even, certain core business criteria can be completely, they have to
Yeah.
be the leaders, the
Yeah.
direction has to be the leaders, but, it will mean deciding to spend your time very, very differently
Yeah.
on
And
self and on
very
the
quickly,
bigger.
yeah, and just quickly to add on that, all that suggests what you were saying, that this thing of the future being all these things that are going to happen. I think humility is an important one. I think all said and done, if I'm a CEO, I'm going to retire one day. I'll have a sudden loss of status, right? I'm going to
Mm,
become a retired ex-CEO. If I'm a senior, VP or so, I'll be an ex-VP. In the end, you will go back to a life that is not the life you have now. So retain that humility. That we are only a small dust particle in this whole in this in the leadership journey in business itself. So retain that humility, and given that humility, then recognize that there's still a lot we can do with humility. Humility, and by the way, as you know, these were the two key characteristics of the good to great leaders, right?
yes.
Fierce resolve, fierce determination, and humility. Who are the
Mm,
great leaders you admire? Gandhi, humility, humble but fierce resolve. So yeah,
mm.
those are the kinds of yeah, as much as possible. It's very hard. It's extremely hard. It's the hardest thing in the world. Try and reduce our ego. It's just so hard. But yeah, try and be a little bit more humble day by day. I think that's. I would suggest that because that enables learning, that enables the kind of curiosity, that enables the
Yeah.
empathy. We are not hot shit after all, right? To put it bluntly.
And that enables one more very practical piece,
Yeah.
besides the orchard part. You see, having a tight leadership team, or what some people like, Flamholz have called a leadership molecule, where it's you along with two or three people who function as one unit. That
Yeah.
requires a different set of different capacity to collaborate, because you recognize that there
Yeah.
are pieces which will be yours, but then there
Right.
will be pieces which will belong to somebody else, because they're also equally smart but in a different way,
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
that
Yeah.
part
And
comes
this
together.
reminds me of Warren Buffett's line always, which actually Bill Gates and on that they advise hire people smarter than you. All that means, don't let your ego get in the way. Hire
Yeah,
people, all those things that lead to better collaboration and so on. Again, these are easy to say. I recognize them, but hard to implement. They
yeah,
require
yeah,
a constant daily work, the
yeah.
polishing of the internal mirror. That's the challenge. Yeah.
Nice, very nice. Let me
Yeah.
just see if there's any other questions. I think there are no more questions, just a lot of comments, which I'm sure you'll also read after this. So, thank you so much, Ram. That was such an interesting conversation. It isn't often one gets the opportunity to have a conversation with someone like you, and our paths have had some similarities. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm so excited that, we've come at it from different places, but I can just see how the whole tapestry sort of emerges. So, thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Thank you, Shalini. And I must say, we come from a similar tradition, I guess, right?
Yes, yes.
Guru.
Right, right,
Yeah,
right, right,
yeah.
right. Absolutely. As I was actually joking with Ram just before that we are like Guru Bhai Behan because
Guru
we both
Bhai, right?
are
That's
actually
right.
from the same school. So obviously
Yes.
we are influenced somewhat. Yeah.
Wow,
Thank
wow,
you.
wow.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you very much. Thank you and good luck to you. Take care
thank
then.
you.
Bye.
Thank you. So, with that, we come to an end to today's episode. I hope you really enjoyed it. Next week, we will be in conversation with Mr. Rajiv Karwal, who is the founder of Milagro Robotics, and we're going to talk about the future of robotics in India. Another really interesting topic, and we look forward to asking him some very interesting questions around what he sees as the future. And of course, as always, a replay of our conversation today will be available on my profile, and by Monday will be available on Uncube's profile. So do have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Stay in touch and join us again next week. Thank you.